Which entity appoints members of the APB, AQB, and ASB? The Board of Trustees. Advisory opinions are best described as not part of USPAP but included as reference material. The guidance issued by the Appraisal Practices Board is considered voluntary. USPAP is developed, interpreted, and amended by the Appraisal Standards Board, who is responsible for issuing credentials to individual appraisers, state appraiser regulatory entities. Which independent board was created within the Appraisal Foundation in 2010? Appraisal Practices Board. If an appraiser assumes a condition to be true that does not exist for the purpose of analysis, this is an example of hypothetical condition. The terms extraordinary assumption and hypothetical condition have different meanings within the USPAP. An appraiser assumes a condition to be true and evidence supports that belief, although fact is not certain. This is an example of extraordinary assumption. Appraisal practice includes only valuation services provided by an individual acting as an appraiser. In USPAP, each standard is composed of standard rules. Who makes identification of intended use in an assignment? The appraiser. Which statement about intended users is true? The client is always an intended user. When obligated by law or regulation, an appraiser blank comply with USPAP. Must. What is the stated purpose of USPAP? Promote and maintain a high level of public trust in the appraisal process. To which property types does USPAP apply? Both tangible and intangible property. The preamble states that USPAP is for appraisers and users of appraisal services. Which statement is true regarding the relationship between valuation services and appraisal practice? Appraisal practice is a subset of valuation services, which could cause an appraiser to prepare an appraiser assignment in conformance with USPAP. Law or regulation, agreement with client, or voluntary choice by the appraiser. One of the appraiser's obligations with regard to user expectations is to identify the capacity in which he is performing. An individual is blank provide valuation services that involve advocacy while acting as an appraiser. Not permitted to. USPAP states that within a situation when an individual is not required by law, regulation, or agreement to comply with USPAP, the individual should still comply when he is acting as an appraiser. When performing valuation services outside of appraisal practice, appraisers must be careful not to blank the client or other intended users about their role. Mislead. The ethics obligations of USPAP apply to individual appraisers only. In appraisal practice, advocating the cause or interest of any party or issue is not permitted. Which statement regarding bias in an appraisal assignment is true? An appraiser is never permitted to perform an assignment with bias. Confidential information under USPAP is information the appraiser received from the client and is identified as confidential but is not available from other sources. A subject property's physical characteristics are blank assignment results. Not. The disclosure of confidential information to a third party is unethical unless authorized by the client. In order to accept an assignment, when an appraiser initially lacks the knowledge and experience to complete an assignment competently, he or she must disclose to the client prior to accepting assignment the lack of knowledge or experience. Appraisers have broad blank and significant blank in determining her appropriate scope of work in an assignment. Flexibility, responsibility. In order to determine the appropriate scope of work, the appraiser must blank the problem to be solved. Identify. The credibility of assignment results is measured in the context of the intended use. Intended uses identified by the appraiser on the basis of communication with the client. Determining scope of work requires information obtained through communications with the client. Identification of the intended use of the appraiser's opinions and conclusions is necessary for determining the appropriate scope of work. The responsibility for the scope of work decision rests with the appraiser. In an assignment, the scope of work is in process, ongoing. Exclusion of a valuation approach that is not applicable in a given assignment is an example of a scope of work decision. An appraiser must not allow client objectives to cause the assignment results to be biased. An appraiser's report must contain blank to allow intended users to understand the scope of work performed. Sufficient information. Scope of work has no disclosure requirements. False. If a client's objectives result in an appraiser developing biased assignment results, the appraiser is solely responsible. An appraiser's peers are defined as other appraisers who have expertise and competency in a similar type of assignment. Exclusion of an approach that is not necessary for credible results in a given assignment is a scope of work decision. In reporting the scope of work under USPAP, the report must contain sufficient information so that intended users understand the scope of work. Determining scope of work requires info obtained through communication with the client. When a law or regulation precludes compliance with any part of USPAP, appraiser must comply with that law or regulation. What is the purpose of the jurisdiction exception rule? To preserve the balance of USPAP if compliance with a part of USPAP is precluded by law or regulation. If an assignment involves a jurisdictional exception, what must an appraiser do? Identify the law, comply with the law, disclose in the report the part of USPAP that is voided, and cite in the report the law that caused the jurisdictional exception. If a law or regulation precludes an appraiser with complying with a part of USPAP, a jurisdictional exception is automatically created. Which of these is an example of a jurisdictional exception in an appraisal assignment? A probate court paying appraisers based on the value of the subject property. When does a jurisdictional exception occur in an assignment? It is automatic when a law precludes compliance with a part of USPAP. A state passes a law requiring appraisers to keep their work files for 10 years after preparation of the report. Would this be a jurisdictional exception under USPAP? No. The requirements of Standard 1 can be used as a checklist by an appraiser who is developing a real property appraisal. Try. Standard 1 requires an appraiser to blank in developing a real property appraisal. Use due diligence and due care. When does a series of minor errors potentially result in a USPAP violation? When the series of errors affects the credibility of the results. USPAP states that an appraiser may not affix the signature of another appraiser blank without his or her consent. Appraiser Amy agrees to present a seminar for a small lending institution to explain appraisal issues to the institution staff. Does the ethics rule of USPAP apply to Amy in performing this activity? Yes, because Amy is acting as an appraiser. No, this is specifically prohibited by the ethics rule. No, this is specifically prohibited by the ethics rule. A supervisory appraiser who knowingly allows a trainee appraiser to communicate a misleading report has violated blank of USPAP. The ethics rule. Who is responsible for complying with USPAP? Individual appraisers only. Under the ethics rule, trainee appraisers have blank confidentiality requirements as compared to supervisory appraisers. The same. May a supervisory appraiser provide blanket authorization for an experienced trainee appraiser to use the supervisor's signature? No, this is specifically prohibited by the ethics rule.